Okay, welcome. I'm Charlie Firestone from the Aspen Institute. Welcome to Tweeting the Revolution: Will Social Networking and Journalism Drive Democracy? There's obviously a huge crowd at the Secretary Duncan speech, so maybe to make this a little more intimate, it would be nice if people kind of came forward to the front of the seating area. That'd be great. To moderate this session, we have the Washington Bureau Chief of NBC Universal, who oversees NBC Network News out of Washington, D.C., MSNBC, MSNBC.com, and any other of the many outlets that NBC Universal has. He's the former editor of Newsweek, Mark Whitaker.
Thanks for coming. And again, anybody who wants to come up a little bit closer, feel free. Well, we've got a terrific panel today to talk about. Well, first of all, I just want to make a couple points. One is this panel was originally conceived basically coming out of the events in Iran over the last month to talk about the role that tweeting and other social media has played in that uprising and in the Middle East in general. That's the rubric for the panel. And I want to start with that, but then branch out to talk about China, because we have Jim Fallows here who just came back, and then perhaps even a little bit about the role that it's playing in our politics here in America. The other thing I'll say, just by way of preamble, is I think the sort of premise, at least that I got from the idea of doing this panel, is that again, tweeting, social media in general, is having a revolutionary effect on popular revolutions and popular political movements. So I think you'll forgive me if I take a little bit of the journalist prerogative and take a little bit of a devil's advocate role in some of the questions, in questioning some of the premise about just how different and transformative all of this actually is. So joining us today are Jim Fallows on my right, national correspondent for The Atlantic. Jim has, over the last 25 years, reported from all over the world: Washington, Texas, Japan, and most recently, China for the last 3 years. He was the former chief speechwriter for Jimmy Carter and editor of U.S. News and World Report. And his latest book is Postcards from Tomorrow Square, Reports from China. To his left, Jeffrey Goldberg, another national correspondent for The Atlantic, veteran of reporter from the Middle East and from Washington, most recently for The Atlantic, before that The New Yorker and the Jerusalem Post, winner of the 2003 National Magazine Award for his coverage of Islamic terrorism, and author of Prisoners, a Muslim and a Jew Across the Middle East Divide. And finally, Andrew Sullivan, who is chairman and CEO of Andrew Sullivan, Inc., but also a senior editor at The Atlantic, writer of the Daily Dish blog on theatlantic.com, columnist for the Sunday Times of London, frequent guests on the Chris Matthews Show, and occasionally Meet the Press and other television shows where I'm sure you've seen him. Former editor of The New Republic, and his most recent book, available up in the bookstore if you want it, and he'll sign it for you, is The Conservative Soul: How We Lost It. Okay, so let's, Jeff, why don't we start with you on Iran. This has been called, what's happened in Iran over the last month, the first tweeting revolution. Twitter itself actually did play a significant role in mobilizing a lot of the supporters for Mousavi, who turned out in the streets both before the election and after the election. But how crucial a role do you think it actually played? Do you think the same thing might have happened without this new technology or not?
Yeah, of course it could have happened without the technology, because it did happen in the past. Right. Obviously, Tiananmen Square happened without the benefit of this technology. Various revolutions across Eastern Europe and before. I think it magnified, intensified, hastened some of what happened. It gave people an ability to build crowds instantaneously in a way that would take several hours to several days otherwise. So I think it was an enormous boon for democratic forces. I do think that, to put it bluntly, Twitter was powerful in this, but I think the sniper rifle has proven to be, at least temporarily, more powerful. In other words, you can gather 1 million people in a square with Twitter in an incredibly fast way. But if the regime you're opposing decides to put snipers on the roof and pick off protesters, it doesn't matter how many Twitter messages I'm going to get.
Could you elaborate on that for people who don't necessarily know exactly how they've done that? Because I think in the West, people were waiting on the model of Tiananmen and previous uprising for government troops to sort of come out in the streets and start tear gassing and so forth. And in fact, they did something very different.
They did something very different and diabolically clever.
Right.
I think, and you know, I'll leave the Tiananmen discussion to Jim, but I think in Tiananmen, the government wanted everyone to see the crushing of dissent. I think the Iranian regime was playing a kind of a more sophisticated game. They didn't want mass slaughter, but what they wanted to do was stop these protests. And so instead of the frontal assault, although you had the frontal assault, you saw those pictures of motorcycles massing and driving protesters back, far more effective and as I said, diabolical, is to put unseen snipers up on roofs. And this is what they did, and of course the most famous shooting of the young woman. You put snipers on roofs, and these bullets come from nowhere, and somebody drops next to you, and then it happens 3 or 4 more times in a period of 10 or 12 minutes. That promotes panic, I think, and the will to survive. Even more than the frontal assault of 1,000 police officers with batons and shields. Something that you can't see is going to provoke more fear than something that you do see. And it turned out to be a very effective way of shutting down some of these protests. I think, personally, that it more than almost anything else showed us the true nature of this regime. But it turned out to be very effective. And of course, it was at that moment when you realize that, IMing and Twitter and all of this stuff is wonderful, but the gun is just going to be more powerful unless you can get the guys who have the guns, convince them to stop shooting.
Now, the government continues to insist that although they've admitted there may have been some irregularities, that essentially Ahmadinejad won 2/3 of the vote. Do you think that, I guess we all tend to believe in the media and the U.S. government that that is not the case, although nobody seems to know what the actual vote might have been. But just in terms of coverage here, do you think the fact that social media was part of it made it more of a sort of a sexy story and perhaps caused us to think that the uprising was more universal or reflected more of the universal will of the Iranian people than perhaps it did?
Look, it's an interesting question. I thought about this a lot. One of the reasons, and Andrew can speak on this because Andrew did more blogging on this than anybody in creation. One of the reasons I think young Americans, internet literate Americans, who don't really care one way or another what happens in Iran, were fascinated by this and were sympathetic was because these people, these foreigners, these very foreign foreigners, if you will, were using technology that we use. And it was absolutely fascinating to us. And it was a bonding experience in a kind of way. It was a virtual bonding experience. These 20-year-old, 30-year-old, even 40-year-old people in Iran, Muslims who we've learned are part of a country that is perpetually an enemy of the U.S. were employing the same exact ways of communication that we use. So I think there's of course a sexiness to any kind of implementation of new technology. But I think more than that, there was like, wow, they're like us, because that's how we communicate with our friends to go out, and they're doing it with an even, they're communicating for a higher purpose. I think there was that feeling that of a bonding kind of experience.
Andrew?
I obviously the student uprising of 2003 was not a Twitter uprising, and it was put down with a similar kind of brutality. I don't think the snipers, although they were very effective, were the only, obviously, tool. I mean, the terrifying night raids which happened, in which the Basij went out at night to target people and vandalize their homes and mark them. And of course, the most remarkable, I think, expression of the people of Iran in this last month has not been twittering, but yelling Allah Akbar from the rooftops every night in a deafening, the most low-tech expression, and it's all they had left. But I think Iran is a very particular case, and because it is, and has been for a while, an extremely bloggy country. It has the third largest number of bloggers of any country in the world. Because if you are an intelligent, humane individual in Iran and you want to actually express yourself and think about the world, there are very few avenues in which you can do this, which doesn't get you into terrible political trouble unless you are doing it online, and that's how you communicate. It's all done either in private rooms or homes, or it's done online. So that's why this particular medium was so important for this event. But I think Jeffrey's absolutely right about the question that we're now looking at, and it's going to be fascinating to watch, is if a regime that has utterly lost its legitimacy within and without, with an entire population that is clearly, and I don't buy at all the stuff that this is a student or upper middle class uprising. It isn't. It was widespread, and what Twitter did and what the online community did was not just corral the response to this coup, which is what has happened essentially. It galvanized the movement in the first place, so that, and not only that, but made those of us outside aware that something was going on, that these Mousavi rallies, as they began to get momentum, this rigged, phony Potemkin democracy within this theocratic state suddenly began to take on a real life. And you could feel it online in a way that, sitting in Washington, I would never have. It was happening spontaneously and coming up from below, and that's how they were organizing these rallies. They were brilliant in understanding that they were going to construct a revolution from within the system, using the arguments and institutions that the founding mullahs of that state, of the Islamic Republic, set up, and that's how it kind of grew and spread. And so when you felt that happening, you also saw in the debates Ahmadinejad getting more and more nutty, and more the accusations, the corruption allegations, the random weirdness. I mean, it was like, it was almost Palin level of insanity.
Almost. Oh, you're just checking.
I was wondering how you were going to get Palin into this discussion.
It was
a particular
4 minutes and 13
preoccupation of
seconds.
Andrew's.
Yeah. It took him 4 minutes and 13 seconds.
But no, you could tell they were panicking. Yeah. The regime was panicking as the election went on, but they didn't get it because these old guys in turbans are not online. And just as I think the Clintons didn't understand what Obama was doing until it was too late, because Obama was doing exactly the same thing, using social networking, using blogging as a tool for organization under the radar, not needing massive organization, not needing massive amounts of money, but then using that to tool money. By the time the Clintons realized this was going on, it was too late. Similarly with the mullahs, I mean, obviously, it's a completely different situation. I'm being, but don't get me wrong. But
to be fair,
the shock.
To be sure,
Hillary
Hillary Clinton is not Ayatollah Khamenei.
Yes, to be sure. But come on. Let me put it this way: the shock the Clintons felt after Iowa is one tiny, mellow, Western, sympathetic fraction of the shock that they realized, I think probably a couple of days before the vote, that they were going to lose in a landslide. And that's why they decided, I think, to preemptively create a vote tally that was announced an hour after the polls had closed, that gave Ahmadinejad a victory far greater than he'd ever received before.
As somebody put it to me,
yeah.
if you're going to steal the election, steal it big and steal it early.
Well, that was the point. It was a
Right.
big steal, a big lie. And they were telling these people, we can do this, screw you all, and you do your worst. And they're hanging people today. They are torturing people in Evin prison today.
Now, why, and I want to bring China and the contrast in with Jim a little bit here. If the regime has been so brutal in the past, has been so brutal in terms of putting down this popular uprising and enforcing the results, the so-called official results of the election, why were they not effective in censoring and intercepting all of this new technology and all of this social media communication that led to the uprising in the way that China certainly has been ever since Tiananmen?
The Great Firewall,
Yeah.
you mean, yeah. Well, I think they have. I mean, I think it just took them a little time.
Didn't they shut down cell phones? That was the
Well,
the
they shut
report
down
inside China.
but
they shut down cell phones.
the real story, and I mean, one of the real troubling stories is the role of Nokia and Siemens in all of this. I mean, they have sold Iran in the last year some of the most effective and sophisticated technology for intercepting all forms of telecommunications. And I mean, disrupting this deep packet inspection, I think they call it, where you can go into the data streams, manipulate them to send out misinformation, identify senders, and you can even organize false rallies. I mean, and they've been doing, with the help of these Western companies, all kinds of nefarious things. They didn't do it at first because I think Andrew was right. I mean, I think the shock was so profound that it took the regime a few days to sort of get on their feet. But when they did, they had, which is interesting because this is the counter to Twitter, is that for every Twitter development in technology, there's a counter development which allows repressive regimes to repress.
Except the one small point I would make about Twitter is that you can slow the internet to a crawl, as they did. It was like 12 kbps or whatever. It was, and so their blogging network couldn't survive. But the tweeting, because it's so short and sweet, and you can use it on cell phones, and it can be very quick and easy. That was the last thing they could get. So that's why it wasn't like they all decided to have a Twitter revolution. They were improvising.
They couldn't have a blogging revolution.
They couldn't have a blogging revolution.
Right.
So so that's how it clearly emerged. And what was amazing to me in the middle of this, experiencing this, was, and this is what Jeffrey said, is that it felt. Now the tweets themselves should be, and I kept saying this, need to be as fact, should be taken very provisionally, not only because people don't understand what's happening in a chaotic situation, but also there was disinformation. But the feel of it, the energy of it, this is the first time that we have been able to be as if we were there in the revolution as it happened, and the whole world could be. So the leverage of the global mind interacting with this particular moment that's what made this so extraordinary. And to be there at 6 in the morning, on Cape Cod, like suddenly getting a YouTube from somebody who's in a riot, who's and sending them to me, and just then put that up and have the whole world see something that happened an hour ago. And so if we'd experienced the French Revolution that way, if we'd got YouTubes of the storming of the Bastille, I mean, that's an incredible global consciousness shift, I think. And that's why I know it sounds naive, and I don't mean to be naive in the face of these bastards who run that country. I'm still confident it's going to win.
But I want to get back to that in a second, but Jim, just to bring you in here, I mean, to the degree that since Tiananmen we have not seen an uprising that has sort of captured the global imagination and been on this scale in China, is that because the government there has been so effective in controlling this technology, despite the fact that it's gotten more advanced and there is more of it, or are there other factors, political and cultural, economic factors?
I think there are a variety of factors. What I've been thinking while listening to this, this fascinating discussion, and not being an Iran expert, really all I know about what's been going on recently in Iran is what I've seen mainly on Andrew's site. It's interesting first about how the global mind has been applied. If a quarter of the people in the global mind are in China, they really were not involved in this at all. It was partly because it was played for various reasons as a page 14 news story in most of the Chinese press. I think it was seen by the Chinese authorities as not that much in it for them to be playing up the story of a protest against an authoritarian regime. And in the Chinese blog world, if you take the fact that none of these, I will assume that most of these tweets must have been in Farsi, but a large number in English, probably zero in Chinese. So there's nothing for the great majority of the Chinese public to follow. What I've been thinking about how the experience I've seen over the last 20 years in Asia compares with this is that, at every moment of political evolution, there's been some technology that's made some difference. Faxes were really a big deal in parts of the Soviet Union, the samizdat, and text messages have been very, very important in China over the last 10 years or so, and mobile phones and radio, pirate radio, all these things have mattered. So the technology of getting people together has always been interesting, always been significant, but it's been kind of a vector diagram between the new technology that's letting people organize and whatever the regime has in mind. I've been thinking, Sam Beer of Harvard died 2 weeks ago or so, and he was a professor of mine when I was an undergraduate, and he had taught this course on what are the conditions that allow for social upheaval or not. And Gandhi's tactics would not have worked against Stalin or wouldn't have worked against the Nazis. And so the point I'm getting to here is that when I first went to Asia 20 plus years ago, I went to the Philippines during the anti-Marcos revolution, and there the main technology for distributing information was the newspaper. Manila had about 30 dailies in those days, and everybody would say, come to the rally for Cory. And in Korea, soon after that, there was a rally, the democratizing rally, and the churches were the main vehicle of information. And in Taiwan, they had radio, and in Tiananmen, originally they had the big character posters, which is sort of left over from the Cultural Revolution. My point is that these things worked in the Philippines and in Korea and Taiwan and didn't work in China because of the nature of the regimes. And I think you could have in China now very, very effective text message communication. That would probably be the way rather than Twitter, because most people, that's the universal standard of communication is the mobile phone. From time to time the government blocks them, but it's hard to do. But it's that everything else in Chinese life makes this not worthwhile at the moment to have some huge massed rally as there is in Iran. Mm-hmm. So an indirect answer, but that's my answer.
So just to get back, so obviously this allows us to feel part of it, to look inside it in a way we'd never have. But does it also distort our view of it and what all the forces at play really are?
It can, in the sense that proximity can distort your view, I suppose. And also, any understanding of an event as it's unfolding is going to be, by its very nature, wrong in many respects. Or it may be right at that particular moment, but wrong a day later. I mean, these catalytic human events are extraordinarily hard to understand, from a historical point of view, sociological, any point of view, especially with a regime like this, which is a very complicated and a changing regime. So I think it can distort. I think the important thing, everything is true as long as it isn't taken to be anything more than it is. All this information is vital and real. The critical thing is to try and understand it in context constantly, to try and also keep looking up at the big picture, to understand the larger forces in the region, for example. But for this instance, obviously this is something that, look, this is in some ways what George Bush argued for. I mean, this is the actual democratic revolution that the United States has been saying needs to happen. Mm-hmm. It didn't happen in Iraq. It happened in Iran. Mm-hmm. And I think it was always going to happen in Iran before it happened in Iraq.
Just coming back to your question, I mean, I think, of course, it's distorting to read. I mean, those of you who haven't done this should go on Andrew's blog and look at some of these Twitter streams, which are, I mean, he has them in green also, so they're delineated and they feel even more urgent for whatever reason. But you read them and you really are taken to the street. And that's very useful. The problem with being taken to the street is that distorting effect of being, if you've covered a battle, you see, as a reporter, you see about 25 feet around you, and you have no idea if the side you happen to be covering is winning or losing. It's the same thing, I think, with Twitter, which is, I'm going to say something on behalf of our antique profession of reporting, which is why you absolutely should read these Twitter feeds, but you need the reporters to filter the information and test it and actually wait a while and think about it and analyze it and then present it in a more complete, coherent package. I think taken together, you'll get a better understanding of what's happening on the streets.
But I think it's also true that reporters on the ground are also suffering from massive distortion of perspective.
Of course.
And especially when they come at it, as we all do, with a set of ideas that we're trying to interpret the world. So I think that in some ways we have a million little reporters as opposed to a handful of experienced long-term ones. Now, I think that what that needs, and especially in a situation like Iran, where they've shut down the reporters. I mean, there is a situation when they've kicked them all out. So then you have no option. But I know we've had a debate about this, but someone like Roger Cohen who goes to Iran and does a report, there are plenty of arguments that he's right or he's completely wrong because his perspective is skewed in a certain way by the people he meets. So I think there is not some golden reporter objectivity standard. Neither is it. And what you need actually in this case is analysis. You need people who understand the history, the language, the culture, and also the broader regional issues. These are complicated, difficult
But you
things.
also need that reporter to go to the site of the murder of this 26-year-old woman and confirm the details. I mean, it's vitally important for the sake of the
you can't do it.
Well, sometimes you can and sometimes you can't. But I'm arguing for both.
Yeah.
I'm arguing for both approaches.
But is a report, because this gets to it, because if you get, let's say, the video of it happening, so we actually, I mean, you can't get a better reporter than an actual video of a dropping
I disagree.
dead.
I disagree. You didn't see where the bullet came from in the video.
No, but that's a start.
It's a start, absolutely.
Then you have the testimony of the person who rushed up to help her. Then you have the testimony that comes out via these issues, not through a reporter, but through these new media that explains what happened in the hospital. Then you get the statement of the government that also comes out without a reporter that is actually in contradiction to the obvious facts. Like they actually said the CIA shot her in the head. Well, everybody knows this is how stupid this regime is in so many ways, that she was shot here.
Yeah. I actually wanted to ask Andrew a question. Andrew's role is probably the leading person, at least in my part of the known world, for collecting all this information coming out of Iran. We certainly, for those of us who are not in Iran, this certainly has given us a sense of the drama and connection we would not possibly have had otherwise. Looking at it with some kind of clinical detachment, is there a reason to think that it's changed the actual correlation of forces inside Iran? Is the outcome of this event going to be any different because of this communication than it would have been 5 years ago?
It's the great question, and we don't know yet the answer to that. But I can't not but believe. I mean, we're still seeing with Mousavi and Karoubi today, and with two other opposition parties, very, very adamant, no backing down from their position. And we've also got today a very senior, really thuggish conservative mullah calling Khamenei, on what he's been doing, because the actual rhetoric, even if it's not the reality of Iran, is that there is some sort of democratic process, and for it to be so grotesquely abused in a way that everybody in that society, except those paid thugs.
For what it's worth, I actually am a little bit more optimistic than Andrew, a little bit more ready to declare something, which I think the instant communication brought out the crowds in huge numbers and quickly, causing a regime response that is irrevocable in a kind of way. And that they murdered their own citizens to stop demonstrations that were aided by this level of communication. The people in Tehran will not forget how the government responded to those rallies, which were in part created by this free technology. And so, in the long term, the regime has lost its legitimacy with those people.
But the other thing is that
Would you like to say something?
I'm
Mark?
sorry, Mark.
No, go ahead.
Sorry.
No, actually, I was going to ask you, since it's something that's been talked about a lot here, how much of a factor, if any, do you think that President Obama's speech in Cairo played? I mean, I think there seems to be a consensus that it did play some role in Lebanon. Was it a factor in Iran? Do you see it? Has it started a process? You talked about the sort of catalytic process of debate and questioning and so forth, and given a certain amount of cover for more moderate pro-democratic forces, that you think is going to continue to have an effect or not?
Here's what
my guess. I mean, I'm happy to let Andrew answer that. My guess is not that much. I think the Iranian people have had plenty of reason to be frustrated with their government, and I don't see that. I don't really see it in Lebanon either, to tell you the truth. But that's just my opinion.
Andrew, go ahead.
I do think that I have several thoughts about that. I do think that, and this I can't prove, but I do feel, and I'll tell you one small anecdote that may be a little self-regarding, but it moved me in a way very much, which is that a lot of us did the rather corny thing of going green. These colors, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine and so on, and we just did it because it was an interesting gesture, and then
how did you go green? I mean,
well, I just begged our tech department to change my background color from dark blue to green, and they have. Do you know what people know what Dig is? Dig.com. It's essentially an aggregator that is generated by users, so that if you see an interesting piece or post that you want other people to read, you nominate it and vote for it. And so the top ones you can, and if you get one of your posts on Dig, it can really build it. Well, there's a Farsi Dig, which I didn't realize, and the fact that I turned green went to the top of the Farsi Dig. That this other blogger out there cares about us and has done this, and it was the most moving thing that happened. I mean, in terms of and so you realize then that they are aware of us, that they understand this globally. And I believe that although the Cairo speech I don't think I think it was a great speech, an important speech, and I do think it will be understood to be a slight catalyst, I think that the American people did it by electing him. And I think the Iranian people elected Mousavi in response to the American people. And I think the American people did it by social networking and the new media, and the Iranian people did it in part through that. Because neither the American people nor the Iranian people wanted to have a nuclear apocalypse, which they saw the McCain and Ahmadinejad moving aggressively towards a conflict. And they were trying to stop it and trying to open dialogue. And of course, in America, John McCain didn't have a coup and start bombing Iran. They did.
A brief response both to Andrew and to Jeff. We always like to notice changes in our language. Andrew's sentence, the fact that I went green went to the top of the Farsi Dig. That's a sentence I don't think...
It's not even English 10 years ago.
2 years ago.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I know. It's very strange.
On Jeff's point about how something irrevocable had happened in Iran, I think it's a very, very interesting parallel to China, because just the things you said, technology brought out a big crowd, they forced the military to shoot its own people. This won't be forgotten. Again, the difference here is the regime, because exactly that happened 20 years ago in China, and it is forgotten by most people.
China is the argument against my argument.
So it depends on whether they're able to maintain the same kind of control.
Right.
And then Obama, of course, by inviting Nico Pitney, who I must say did a fantastic job in doing this at the press conference, specifically to get him to ask a question that he had asked his Farsi-reading Iranians to ask, was another moment when it showed that actually Obama understands this revolution, that he was going to get a question that came from below, not from this clerisy of the White House press corps. And the question itself was actually about as tough as it gets, as hard as it gets, which is, okay, so now you're going to have a negotiation with Mr. Ahmadinejad, who just murdered our friends and has unleashed these ghastly Basijis upon us and it has a fascist coup in our country. You're really going to now sit down with this little, and that was a tough question. And he completely dodged the answer. So that's and then of course, the Washington Post gets on his high horse and claims it's all rigged and
well, it was rigged.
No, it was not rigged in the slightest.
It was rigged.
It was only rigged in as much as he was given an invitation. The question was not rigged.
Look, let me tell you, they rig every press conference. They have
Right.
a whole
Rigged
list
these-
of who's
these
going to be
reporters-
called on
I'm
in what order.
I'm not arguing against it. I'm just saying let's face facts that it was a setup. And
Yeah,
I'm not saying
he invited him.
it wasn't an unuseful setup, but it was a setup.
Okay, before we
Andrew and I
open-
can, even when we agree on everything, disagree on everything. It's a fantastic process.
Right. That's what makes you such great panelists. Before we open up to questions, I just want to, stipulating that we can't really tell, none of us knows how this is going to play out in Iran over the next few months. But looking down the road more broadly, when you think about, again, all these forces that have been unleashed, the power of technology, the power of social media and this kind of communication, how will it change Iran, the rest of the Middle East, Asia, say over the next 5 years? What will change and what won't change?
Can I just very quickly? What I fear the most is that countries like Burma, North Korea, obviously, the most highly repressive regimes will become even more repressive because they see the danger of technology, of this new people empowering technology, and that countries that are semi-repressive will be calling up Nokia Siemens, the consortium, to get the more sophisticated interruption packages and surveillance packages. So I worry about that. And, and this is where this conversation, the idea of this kind of people revolution, technology-driven people revolution, hits a wall, because you do have certain countries in the world that we're all concerned about, North Korea and Burma being the sort of the topmost in my mind, Syria too, to a large degree, where you're not going to have a Twitter revolution, because every aspect of a person's ability to access communications is controlled by the state. So if you were a leader of Burma right now, you would be, and a clever one, you'd be looking at what's happening in Iran and figuring ways to stop this from ever happening in your country. That's what I worry about.
Jim, what do you think?
I love technology, but have a very modest view about technology's ability to change fundamental political power balances. And so we saw, again, the Philippines, South Korea, et cetera, were ready to accept the results of a revolution long before there was an internet. And in Iran, it probably is not going to succeed, at least in the short term, and it wouldn't in China now. So I think that the basic dynamics of power relations are what will remain there, and the technology will be the newly interesting facet year by year, but not changing the fundamentals.
Andrew?
I fear that Jeffrey's right, but here's where I think there might be a way around that, especially in someone like Iran, is that it's certainly not sufficient to do the job. It definitely helps expedite it, and because the new media is very bottom-up, it is something that is actually much harder to control than things in the past. And therefore, the regimes have a really tough time. And the Burmese regime, for example, is so absurdly medieval, has no understanding of any of this stuff. I mean, they're more likely consulting their horoscopes at this point. They are absolutely batshit. But the thing about Iran is its economy is terrible. I mean, they're an oil-rich country that the mullahs can't run an economy. And at some point, the combination of economic implosion, especially if we do our bit to try and accelerate it, plus the establishment and the recognition that not only are your views about the illegitimacy of this regime strong, but they are shared, and you know they're shared because this communication tells you they're shared. Not only that, you know that everyone around the world shares it. That's a psychological and spiritual, in a way, transformation, if allied with economics and, to some extent, maybe a crack in these elites. Because at some point, these regimes, someone in Iran has to understand they've got to somehow get an economy that makes any sense. And they will also understand that the economies that actually grow in this era will require the kind of technology that will be very hard to control. Now, I think China has delivered amazing amounts of economic growth and prosperity to its people. And so it has been able to do that other bargain. Now, I don't see the Iranian regime being able to make that bargain with its people. It doesn't have the ability to buy them off because it doesn't have the know-how to do this. And especially now, I think we should have a more economically, I don't quite know what we should do now because, frankly, I don't know what is going to happen in Iran now. But I think put it this way, I don't think it will do it in and of itself, but I think it shifts global consciousness in alliance with other factors. It could be a real danger for tyranny. And I think, to give George W. Bush credit, he understood this thing. Even if he didn't understand how to do it, he understood that if people have the right to govern themselves, they will not behave in the way that many of these Middle Eastern regimes behave.
I've heard it argued that actually Bush helped create some of this dynamic by giving an opening for the hardliners to sort of assert themselves against America and then to overplay their hand in a way that may boomerang against them. But it's interesting. I was thinking that you might call this the meetup effect, and you were talking about the parallels, such as they are, with our election, and it reminded me a little bit of those Democrats in the dark red states who didn't know there were any other Democrats, and then thanks to new technology, all of a sudden could find each other.
Look at the crowds that Obama brought onto the streets of this country, which is unprecedented. In some ways, you could say the Iranian Revolution, even though it may have initially been crushed, was the biggest flash mob in human history.
Yeah.
Now that's a very powerful thing.
We have about 15 minutes for some questions. Jeff. Sure. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I'm Steve Reddish from Voice of America, and we use Twitter quite a bit and saw a lot of the results of the social media, and then used our television programs to beam it back, so to speak. You touched on the issues of trying to report accurately what comes in on Twitter and Facebook and YouTube and various different citizen journalism medium. And we had this, same issues as far as what to report, how to report it. And I just wanted to ask how you all see citizen journalism moving what you do. You as Washington Bureau Chief, Mark, and you as reporters and journalists to be able to reflect accurate information to your audiences.
Well, I would say two things just on our part. I think that this was sort of a watershed experience for the media, because having a story of this magnitude, where in the middle of it, essentially almost everybody was thrown out, and we had to, the only way we could really have a kind of window into what was happening was by tapping into it. I think a lot of the sort of still residual prejudices against mobilizing and using social media just fell apart, because it was the only thing we had to work with. The other thing I would say is, to the degree that the media, I think, kind of old line mainstream media still, I think, wants to be a reliable filter for this information, I think we have to recognize that if we're pulling our punches or we're refusing to tap into some of this, people can find it someplace else. So the fact that we're filtering it doesn't mean that it's still not out there and still playing a very powerful role in the way that people understand and follow these stories.
It's definitely, since I started blogging 10 years ago to now, I found that the impact of the voices of people outside of journalism has simply grown and grown and grown. Let me give you a non-Iranian example, which after the assassination of George Tiller, the late-term abortion doctor, just in my email in tray, a woman wrote me in that emotional moment when people were raw, her own account of her own late-term abortion and why she did it and what it was like. Now, I don't think a reporter could have gone out and found that person at that moment of emotional vulnerability and candor, and got that story. Once I put that one email up, the floodgates opened. And I had emails from women who told stories that were as powerful as any reported piece you could ever find, that actually changed my mind on this question in a way that I think no other form of journalism would have changed my mind. And That's astonishingly powerful. And I think that's... Now, could I go in and re-report everything they were telling me? No. Did I know that they weren't just, some fantasist? No, except you can and you learn in this medium to use your common sense, because you can internally stories make sense or not. Now, as long as you present it, I think, in that context, and understand this is the provisional nature of the truth we're doing, then it's a fantastic advance in getting at the truth of the world, which is what we're supposed to do in journalism, right? Journalism, in my view, has become much too much about journalists. And living in Washington, Jesus, is it about them? That's what they live for.
Because we're so fascinating to ourselves.
And having this absurd thing where I'm sitting here and I have two colleagues who help me, but about a million people a month who's sending the stuff back at me like an ocean wave, and trying to find a way. And this is a constantly improvised thing. I mean, I don't pretend to have gotten it right yet, but I'm thrilled by this. I think this is the most amazing advance for journalism in a very, very long time. And I find the mainstream media's initial reaction to this hostility, prejudice, fear, panic, to be entirely a function of why they need to get their act together.
Oh, I think that does it.
Jeff?
Pardon me, I was tweeting. It was a good line, Andrew. You have many of them. I'm Jeff Jarvis, and I've been wondering, thinking, now knowing what we know now out of what happened in Iran, how should news organizations prepare themselves for the next one? And the one thing that I think of is the more we have a network of people we know in the country, 10 bloggers or 10 tweeters, and they know 10, and they know 10, you start to have a network of people you can verify in this very unverified world are actually there. You know a little bit about them. Then you're stronger than your competitor. You're stronger than the next one, whether it's Andrew doing it or the New York Times or the Guardian, who all did great blog, Huffington Post, 4 great blogs were in this. That gets us somewhere when we're going to be kicked out. In the blog days, we were thinking about having bloggers, in situ. Not that the blog is over. Cameras, people. What can we learn from this in terms, as news organizations, as journalists, in our relationship with these worlds, so we're better off and can do a better job the next time?
Well, again, you think about the Obama administration. What did they do, or the Obama campaign? What did they do? Which was they didn't just sort of get those text messages and then, kind of discard them. They kept them, and they used them to start a conversation that kept up throughout the campaign. So I would say the same thing. I mean, to the degree that we can communicate back, we keep that communication going because they become sources. I mean, in the way that traditionally we've had sources through other media.
No, I mean it's a very smart point in a particular geographic area that I'm interested in, the West Bank. I've begun to do what you're talking about, which is to sift some of the bloggers and people who email me, and try to test in my own mind their credibility in different ways over time, so that when the drama comes, as it inevitably does in a place like the West Bank, I'll have a network of people in different settlements, let's say, who are feeding me information. The smart reporter will treat all of these tweeters and bloggers and everybody else and sort of non-professional journalists as sources and feeders, and you could sort of magnify your own reporting that way. But pre-sifting is probably a useful thing so you don't get caught.
Do you know about Michael Rosenblum's project with the flip cameras? Michael Rosenblum, who champions the one-man band video movement, is giving away 100 flip cameras to families in, and I'm sorry, I can't remember whether it was Gaza or West Bank, and then try to draw their stories back out. Rosenblum TV, you'll just be interested.
Okay.
My name is Satoshi Ikeuchi from Japan. I'm a researcher on the Middle East affairs, and I'd rather, join your fascination in the Iranian Twitter revolution. But as an academic, I always go back to history and think again. And we don't need to think all the way through history, think again about it. Because after, if we take up the topic of Iraq, we find another, kind of vigorous movement by the people utilizing free new technology. It's a Iraqi insurgency. They disseminated, many videos in the YouTube and other websites, and they uploaded it, and their discussion pages and home pages were mainly they were in Arabic. So you may not, sense that, but there is a vigorous movement on the internet, but they were, insurgent against the United States. So I want to, I'd be very glad if you share your views on the last internet revolution. It's Iraqi insurgencies, use of new technology. How do you, define them, and what do you, call them, and what's the experience we had?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very smart point, in as much as obviously this organization can be used for very destructive methods. It can also be used for propagandistic purposes. But I think it says a lot about the difference between Iraq and Iran, that the technologies used in Iraq to foment violence, and in Iran was used to actually try and resist violence, which I think is a very interesting indicator about the possibility for democracy in both those countries. So yeah, one other small point to Jeff, I think that Jeff Jarvis is that yeah, you have to develop sources, and these are the sources, but the sources also come to you. They test you too. They follow you. If they think you are trustworthy, they will send stuff to you. If they think you're if they think you're a propagandist, or if they think you're not honest with them, or if they think you've distorted stuff, you will lose it. So it's a fascinating thing, because in some ways the sources are now keeping the journalists honest, and they push back all the time at you. And then, of course, you have this strange thing in which the sources talk to you all the time, even when they don't tell you stuff. So it's not like, they express their emotions, their feelings.
Yes, they do.
I know.
Yes, they do.
And, I don't know how, I get like 600 or 700 emails a day, and obviously I can't read them all, but you'd be amazed what you learn from their feelings and their passions and even sometimes their most banal stories about themselves.
Let's get our last two questioners in here.
Hi, I'm David Kunyan from New York. Andrew, your comment about kind of the global spiritual change that's here, it was bringing me back to sort of Max Weber and sort of the Protestant Revolution or Reformation in the spirit of capitalism, about how technological change really has a part that it's not coincidence that Switzerland is both the beginning of the Industrial Revolution at some level, as well as the Protestant Reformation. And I'm curious about whether or not specifically within Islam, not so much on a global basis spiritually, but whether or not, so much of the Cairo speech was about sort of starting a dialogue, a change in American policy to say that, in a Petraeus way, we've got to work not just militarily, but inside of Islam, and get a dialogue going on between radicals and more moderate voices. And I'm just curious if you're sensing that this spiritual change that you're talking about, how it's playing out throughout the reactions within the Muslim world about a changing nature, a reformation within Islam.
To my mind, if you are a Muslim and you have a mind and you are interested in the texts and the origins of the texts, and you write something in the press, you will probably be imprisoned, jailed, or tortured in many of these places. But online, the space for that tiny space between orthodoxy and criticism, which is how religion actually, I think, breathes and lives and develops, that has been opened a little bit, a tiny bit. And the sheer spirit of actual real discourse, conversation, profound. Obama is a community organizer. So his fundamental understanding, I think, of how this stuff works is if he can get that going, and he's patient about it, but if he can get it going, then he can slowly tilt the top, but he needs the bottom.
Well, and the fact that Allah Akbar becomes sort of the revolutionaries' call is part of what I guess I'm asking.
And the fact that Mousavi is talking about democracy and these things as part of Islam, that they are criticizing Ahmadinejad and Khamenei, and even today a conservative cleric is criticizing them for betraying Islam. Now, if you don't, I think that's a huge step forward, and I think it's been facilitated by what's happened. I think it's been galvanized by this new media. So the potential for that is phenomenal, because the key to peace in our world is a Muslim reformation. Until we get that, we're going to have this conflict indefinitely, possibly at a level of technology that could provide immense destructiveness. So that's my sense. It may be too late. There may be other forces that quell it, but I think it will win in the end. I believe that. And I also think it is spiritual. I agree with you. I think there is something spiritual about this. There was something deeply spiritual about this movement in Iran that was actually very religious. It was very much like the civil rights movement. I mean, it really is actually a campaign for voting rights. That's what it is. It's a spontaneous demonstration, non-violent demonstration to have their votes taken seriously. Now, that is because they're each worthy in the eyes of God, and because that is what they believe. They're not secular Western Democrats. They are faithful Muslims in many cases, but have a different vision of Islam than the besieged.
Jeffrey, just briefly before we get to the last question.
Sorry, I didn't want to...
Reformation in the Islamic world? I mean, how?
Next Tuesday.
hopeful?
It's good next Tuesday. I mean, if they let the blogs blog.
It starts next Tuesday.
It starts next Tuesday. It ends the week from next Thursday. Are you asking whether it's the most important thing?
Whether it's the most important, and just how?
I'll tell you that
how realistic it is.
Eventually, it's realistic. All religions reform eventually, and I'll tell you something interesting about. I mean, I worry about the space, the virtual space, for Muslims in the Muslim world to have that discussion, because repressive governments want to repress that conversation and have the technological means in some cases to do that. But it's interesting. The most vibrant discussions about Islam and Reformation and allowing the religion to breathe and think take place, of course, in this country, because it's safe. You can be a dissident Muslim thinker. You can question the literal truth of the Quran here at UCLA or the University of Chicago or in Maryland in a way that you can't do it in Tehran or really across much of the Muslim world. And there is a virtual component of that. And I talked to some professors who are involved in that sort of Reformation movement, if you will, who say that they post their material online, and that's the way they communicate with the mass of Muslims who live in Muslim majority states, and so the Muslim Reformation that is coming, whether it's 5 years or 10 years or 100 years, it will be abetted, and I think it's being hastened by the ability of people in safe places to communicate with the people in unsafe places in ways that they can never before.
Last question.
When the English were translating the Bible in the 16th century, you couldn't do it in Spain.
Yeah, right. All
right? I mean, that's the equivalent moment when the Reformation started happening in the northern European states. The Spanish Empire, which was way more powerful at that point, you couldn't do it. But it broke in the end.
I'm Dave Hughes. I'm asking this question because I don't really know how I feel about the possible answers. I'm curious what your feeling is about American enthusiasm and passion for revolutions that occur in totalitarian states where the Western people are not personally in danger or threatened in particular ways. What's the meaning and what are the results of that kind of enthusiasm? People were talking about Burma, and I remember when Burma had the Saffron Revolution, there was a great deal of enthusiasm on the internet, and The Economist had a cover story about the Saffron Revolution that was very kind of enthusiastic and seemed to think that it was going to work out, and then there was a huge, brutal crackdown that killed, tens of thousands of people. I wonder what your sense of the meaning of our enthusiasm is.
Yeah, I was actually there at that time in Burma, and so I know what you mean about let me grant a point that it's easy for people from the editorial pages of The Economist or Salons to Aspen or whatever to say, oh yeah, you guys should go and protest against the SLORC and get mowed down by them, SLORC being the ruling group in Burma. However, I would defend in general the impulse this way. Number one, it is of course the birthright of the Western world to believe that people should be self-governing and free and have liberties all around the world, and so it is worthwhile encouraging that. Number two, there are very few cases I know of, and probably the main exception I'd think of is when I was a kid, the Hungarian Revolution uprising in 1956, where the U.S. egged them on much farther than they would have gone on their own.
Kurdistan in 1991
yes,
also.
right, yes. Those would be the two
yeah.
classic examples. Most cases, it's not pushing them to do things. It's encouraging them in directions they would like to go anyway, as opposed to suckering them on into ultimate slaughter. So I think it's been a worthwhile sentiment from the Western world to encourage this kind of movement.
What he said.
But there's also a distinction between a government doing it and the civil society doing it.
Yes.
What I find really inspiring about this is that, first of all, as Jeffrey said, the notion that Iranians or Muslims are somehow this other that we don't even recognize as fully human, which I think is very deep in our consciousness, even when we fight against it, is real. And this ended the other because they were us. And I think a lot of Americans for the first time understood that, Iranian people are very, they look, they feel, they speak, their feelings, their emotions are ours. And that itself has helped diffuse this conflict. I also don't know anybody who, in those situations, subsequently says, "I wish the West had never supported us."
Right. Well, this question leads to a completely separate conversation about the inadequacies of both foreign policy realism and neoconservatism or liberal interventionism or whatever you want to call it. The sort of the idealism versus the realism argument. Neither has really been truly adequate to this complex Iran situation, but there is a practical answer to what you're saying, and I think that practical answer we saw in the Cold War when the U.S. supplied, in many cases, the latest technology, which in many cases was Xerox machines and mimeographs in a sort of subterranean way to dissident groups on the other side of the Iron Curtain. The AFL-CIO, as you know, was very, very deeply involved in subterranean organizing of free labor movements in that period. And I think, Andrew, I think would agree on this, is that the basic American impulse is to want to help people become as free as we are, and that is the right impulse. Obviously, in certain recent cases, you can't really do it militarily, as we've seen, as we learned the hard way, and you have to do it with a plan. But I think as we move forward with Iran and achieving this goal of helping the Iranians be free and doing it in a sophisticated way that doesn't hurt the cause, there are things that America can do and the administration can do to provide the technology or to stop companies from providing technology that repress free expression in these countries. And that's what I hope that this next phase is, that we see the Obama administration moving into sort of a practical discussion of, okay, how do we help these people be free in sophisticated ways that don't backfire on them?
I also, just one last thing about this. I do think the one critical media institution that made the real difference in this state was BBC's Farsi service, which was from a satellite that they were able to prevent being blocked. And I do think you can understand why these mullahs have gone into there. I know they're old, blame the British for everything. But one of the reasons they've done that is twofold. One, the BBC really did help. Right. And two, they want to keep Obama. They don't want to attack him. Right. Because they might want to do a deal.
I will use my moderator's prerogative just by having slightly the last word on that, which is, as we've seen in Iran, I think it is very delicate for the U.S. government to intervene in these kinds of situations because of national sovereignty and the possibility that the hardline regimes will use that as a pretext for getting even more brutal. I think this new technology and social media still allows the people in these countries to feel that the American people are with them, even when the government can't necessarily come out and say that. I want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank the panelists. And it was totally coincidence that there were birds tweeting throughout this conversation about tweeting in the revolution. Thanks for coming.